Hello and welcome to The Shortlist. My name is Johnny Campbell. I'm your host of the Shortlist podcast and live show, and also CEO and co-founder of Social Talent. So welcome to show, I think 52 is today. And we're going to be talking about a topic I think absolutely every one of you can hopefully get involved in. And that is the future of networking. There's no going back. The last year has been just a remarkable year. We've changed so many things. We talk about it regularly on the show, have done so for pretty much all of our 50-something shows to date. And today is no different, but it's the first time we're talking about the topic of networking. And I'm really excited with our guest today. But a quick reminder for those of you who are listening to our podcast and recording of this, it's actually a live show that broadcasts every Wednesday afternoon. That's UK Ireland time at 4 p.m. If you're listening live, welcome. We'd love to have your comments. You can listen live every Wednesday on YouTube or on my LinkedIn profile. So Social Talent on YouTube, or you can look up Johnny Campbell on LinkedIn and find it on my live profile. We'd love to hear your comments and questions throughout the show, so please join in. If you're listening live and you think you might want to drop off after 20 minutes, don't forget our podcast is usually up and running on a Wednesday evening, Thursday morning, every single week. And you can subscribe on iTunes, Apple, or Spotify. If you want to find out more about the show and check out our previous episodes, watch the live videos, or check out those links, you can do so at socialtalent.com/the shortlist. So on to today's topic, right? So the power networking experts out there, would agree that networking is really, really important. It's a powerful tool. It's really important for all of us, whether we're a business leader, whether we're an employee running our own business, working for somebody else. One conversation can literally alter the course of your life. But COVID has pushed a large portion of the workforce online. And it's really important now to ask, how do you make sure you're still networking successfully and efficiently over Zoom calls, Slack messages, and what does the future look like? I know for one, I've built a business around networking. Okay, this isn't a business that does networking services, but I know the access I've had to the talent acquisition industry, the access I've had to find great speakers, to build a platform, to figure out how to start a business like we have in Social Talent, all came through networking. And they came through in-person networking. They came through meeting people at different events, getting off and a plane somewhere and going somewhere, having a chat with a bunch of folks in a conference room in a hotel, bar afterwards, restaurant, food, keeping in touch. That network over the years has enabled us to build Social Talent. And so we are living in a world today where that kind of physicality of that international physicality of a network is not available. Even on the domestic level, for many of us, we haven't been able to go further than 3 or 4 miles or 5 kilometers of our homes. So it is a good question to ask, what does networking look like in 2021 and onwards? Our guest today, Kingsley Aikins, has the answers. I actually do believe he does have the answers. He's the CEO of the Networking Institute, and he believes that when business is down, you paint the shop. And now is the time to take stock and get prepared for whatever comes next. And there's still a huge yearning to be part of a community. We all have this built into us. And whilst networking may look a little bit different right now, it is so super important to remain engaged and proactive. And whilst tech will play a role, I think, Kingsley, you would probably caution against completely starching the traditional human aspects of networking out of the equation. Kingsley, welcome to the show. It's a real pleasure to have you. I first heard you 10, 12 years ago and still tell people about what I learned in that 30-minute talk. So I'm expecting big things of you. Maybe you can start by perhaps introducing yourself to our international audience if they don't know you, and maybe explain why networking, why has this become the career-defining thing for you?
All right. Well, thank you very much, Johnny. That introduction, I think, was way over the top and over-egged and over-exagerated. But I have to admit, it was exactly the same as the one I emailed you last week. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for getting that one right. Look, I'm a huge fan of networking. And basically, my experience in life, I lived and worked in 6 countries around the world. In most of those countries, I didn't know a sinner when I arrived. I met a lot of sinners since, but I knew that to survive and thrive, I had to build a strong and diverse network. There was kind of no option, no alternative to it. I had to do it. So I realized the kind of networking, it's not a luxury, it's a necessity. And, I think to survive and thrive in this world, you have to have a network, not just for your professional life, but also for your personal life. So really, there's no option but to do this stuff. And that's what I discovered.
I totally agree. And it's something that I have found personally, and we'll talk about this again in a few minutes. I've had to make very deliberate time to network in the last year and a half. And, I try never to refuse the opportunity to talk to somebody new who gets introduced to me, or I find, even though you might be faced with mounting pressure, lots of deadlines, lots of other things to do, I guess when you have the benefit of many years or decades of working, when you see, as I have and you have, the benefits of a strong network, I see the benefit of taking a couple of hours out for someone completely new, where there's no transaction to be had. You're wondering, there's nothing there for you to get out of it. But I know that that's not the purpose. The purpose is a connection, a net relationship. They might get tons out of it. And that over time, having a network of folks and being able to introduce to different people from different backgrounds always works out in the end. Like always, it is a strong thing. Perhaps difficult to maybe get perspective of maybe earlier in your career when you don't have that kind of benefit of hindsight. And maybe it's more difficult to try and do now. So I want to get into some of those issues. I want to talk about them, but I'm going to start by framing it with something, a bit of research that both of us read in the last couple of days that comes from our regular weekly news. Now, let's go with some news. Whilst this might not have been in the front pages of your tabloids, there was a great piece of work published in Harvard Business Review back in February, Kingsley, and it's entitled Research, We're Losing Touch with Our Networks. And we'll share the link live to those of you listening on YouTube and LinkedIn, by Marissa King and Balash Kovac. And basically, I thought this was fascinating because the researchers, whether by accident or design, they had worked with, I think, 200 plus people, and they'd analyzed their networks and asked them a bunch of questions before the pandemic. And then they asked them similar questions after the pandemic. And at a high level, I'll summarize and maybe get you to share your thoughts on it. They discovered that our professional and personal networks have shrunk by about 16%, very precise number, during the pandemic. And for the most part, they talk about how it's shrunk on the fringes, the kind of call them the weaker ties of your network are shrinking more. And very interestingly, it's actually shrunk for men, not just more than women, but actually it's really only shrunk for men. So they're the two big things that I took from this, and there's lots more in there. Love to hear your thoughts on this, because I think it touches on a lot of stuff that you might have been well aware of or come across a long time before this article was published.
Yeah, well, actually, coincidentally, Marissa King, I read her book about 3 weeks ago. I bought a book called Social Chemistry. She's a professor in Yale University in the US, and this book of social chemistry, because I was beginning to think, I think there's a hidden cost in COVID that doesn't get talked a lot, very much. And that's the fact that it's what we call network shrinkage. It's actually our networks have decreased in size. Now, she pointed out something extraordinary. I didn't realize it, that actually men's networks, she said, have decreased by 30%, and women's networks haven't decreased at all. And the reason for that, she said, was that, men like to do stuff with other men very often. They like to go for a pint, as we say here in Ireland, or they like to go to a football game, or they like to play golf or go fishing, sort of transactional male things. Because women actually quite like spending time together and conversing and chatting, etc. And, I have to admit, when I looked at our household here, if my mate rings me up and says, do you fancy a pint? I say, yeah, I'll see you down in the Boozer, in 15 minutes. And that's the end of the conversation. I see him down there. But I noticed when one of my wife's girlfriends rings her up and says, would you like a glass of Chardonnay down the Boozer? They have a chat for an hour, and then they go down and have that meeting in the Boozer. So, I think that's absolutely fascinating. And it is a reflection of something that's going on out there. I also think that, we are paying this kind of price, normally in the old days, sort of pre-COVID days, your networks didn't shrink. They actually churned, in other words, you found new connections that replaced old ones, but that's not happening. It hasn't been happening under COVID. We haven't been replacing our traditional old connections with new connections, because we kind of couldn't and can't. And we've actually, one of the points that Marissa makes in her book is that we've kind of shifted time and attention away from strangers and the weak connections, as you indicated, which are on the outer concentric rings of our networks. And we've spent more time with our bonded, close relationships, our family and our close friends. And that might be just as few as sort of 5 or sort of 10 sort of people. But there are implications in that, it has impacts on careers. It has impacts on jobs. There's less sort of serendipity and luck and chance going on. Business development is not happening the way it did pre-COVID. I mean, I think people are doing a good job keeping in touch with their existing clients and customers, but actually not developing new ones. So I think there's a price to be paid for this. And although it's not being talked about very much, I'm delighted that Marissa King brought attention to it.
Yeah, I was thinking about that perspective around, you mentioned business development, but growing a business or starting a company, international company in particular. Like we 98% export in social talent. And thankfully we're 10 years old. So we did a lot of networking, built a brand over the last 10 years. I'd hate to be doing it from scratch right now because I just don't know how I do it, because the way we did it is not available to us right now. And I think it just will be so much harder, and is harder for those companies or individuals out there trying to do this, trying to reach out. You can trade off your existing network. I think for a time, maybe we're coming to the end of that year and a half, might be pushing it. But if you're having that shrinkage, does that end? Is that like, I didn't discuss it. Maybe the book went into more detail, Kingsley, if you can share it. But is that a continuing trend? Do you keep eating 30% off every year if you're a man? Or was it a one-time movement to online, you drop 30% and then you'll hold? What are your thoughts on that? Is that a continuing thing we're likely to see if this goes on longer?
Well, it's not all bad news, I have to say. I mean, I think there's some vocabulary I struggle with. I think this notion of remote working is probably, to me, that sounds all about loneliness and isolation, remote. I think it should be called digital working rather than remote working. I also think social distancing is not the right correct expression. I think it should be physical distancing, but social connecting. And actually, out of that, the difficulties of COVID, actually something interesting has come, which is the fact that we have all developed an affiliation to using Zoom and et cetera, and developing networks that way. Now, I totally and utterly miss and struggle, and I'm struggling, I must say, with the situation as it is now. But that said, credit where credit is due. The thing about Zoom is that you actually are unrestricted geographically. You can connect with anybody, anywhere in the world, and for free. And I don't know about your business, Johnny, but in my business, I find free a very compelling price point. So that's an attractive thing. Also, we're saving, we're not spending time and energy and money and carbon footprint and grooming time, flying all over the place to have meetings and nothing ever happens. I think that's a kind of a plus. Also, everybody's available. I mean, if you think about it, I keep getting calls. I don't know if you get these calls, Johnny, but I keep getting calls, people saying, are you around next week? Of course I'm around next week. I'm not going, I can't go anywhere. And so I'm available. And also more people are spending more time online than ever before in history. And because of one company, LinkedIn, we now can find out a huge amount about people, about their experience, about their education, about their interests and hobbies. So there's, so certainly the business I have, we've developed an entirely new tribe of supporters internationally, partly because we looked at online connectivity as not a mechanism for selling. We said, let's use this to serve, not sell. And let's use it, to use the cliche, now is the time to shine online, to build an online presence and identity and brand, if you like. And I think that when we go back, and that's probably the wrong expression, when we go on to whatever the next phase of work, and it's definitely, we're all going to work and learn and travel and educate ourselves differently in the future. But when we go to that period, I think we're going to have not only our existing traditional networks, which we had before, and we've made a big effort to keep in touch with, but we're going to have a whole other new tribe of connections around the world, and it's around the world, that we hadn't got before. So not all negative is the story.
I totally agree. I'll share a personal and business story that backs that up. One is, again, my group of friends, maybe we're traditional males in that we're lousy at phone calls and connecting. We're not great at regularly meeting up. We don't hold it against each other either, which is probably the plus side. But during COVID, we started doing Zoom poker calls once a month. We used to play poker twice a year. Now we're playing it every 4 weeks. And there's a bunch of us who live overseas who never got involved. And now they're as involved because the barriers aren't there anymore. And we've actually never kept as in touch in the last year and a half as we have as a group of lads who grew up together. So that's a personal side. I find a huge benefit from that. There's less one-on-one conversations, because when you do go to a pub or a restaurant, you do break off and you talk to the person beside you. The challenge of a Zoom call is that it's a 6-way conversation, and not every topic lends itself to a 6-way conversation, On the business side, though, I think what I've always seen, and, like yourself, having run a business that's very internationally focused, even when I, first set up our first recruiting business before Social Talent, myself and Vince, my business partner, we had lived abroad. So we started with international in mind, and we were using Skype as our mechanism. He lived in Waterford, I lived in Dublin, which are two different counties separated in Ireland, for those of you listening from abroad. And we just kept Skype on for 10 hours a day, and just like, it was like someone sitting beside you. But, we had this sense that, just because someone isn't next to you physically doesn't mean you can't do business with them, hire from them, work for them. So we got that early, but I think more people have realized that in the last year, whereas their habits might have been, you go to a business meeting in person, you have to talk to a potential candidate in person. And now we can't do that. You go, well, I don't really know where this person is. And just because they coincidentally happen to be in the same city as me, because that's the way I've always worked, they don't need to be. I could provide this same service to a different part of the world, whether that's, I see in the recruiting world, for example, recruiters traditionally worked in the same buildings as the hiring managers they served, and there was a feeling that we needed to have the recruiter available to pop down to my desk to have a chat with. And the candidates had to be able to come to the city and meet me. That's gone, and you don't need it, So I think you're right. There's so much more opportunity that opens up when you realize that we've survived just fine, and there's so much more potential out there.
And I think there's another dynamic out there, possibly for the first time in history. It's now more important what you do than where you are. That's fascinating. And I've always been interested in the whole diaspora connectivity that countries have. And I've worked with about 30 countries, helping them develop relationships with their diaspora. Because in the old days, your geography dictated your identity. If you lived in Southern California, that's who you were. That's where you were. And that was it. But now you can live in Southern California and be totally committed back to Scotland or Poland or Portugal. That's an interesting sort of hyphenated life that people can lead. So I think that's fascinating. And, we've all embraced this Zoom thing. In fact, I have to say, my mates, I've got these mates a bit like yours in the poker. They call me a baby Zoomer because I'm doing so many of these. In fact, one rather nastily calls me a Zimmer Zoomer, which I think is a little bit tough. But I actually think it's really liberated us in many ways. And it's liberated. We now say in our business, geography is history. It just doesn't matter where you are, what you do. The world is more a mosaic than a melting pot, which is another interesting way of looking at things. So I think that those different dynamics have been accelerated by what's happened in the last year and a bit.
I'm going to push forward to our second news story, Kingsley, an article. This one comes from Forbes, and it's titled 14 Professional Tips for Networking During the Pandemic. This was kind of a best of tips from a panel of 14 council members in Forbes that was published very recently. And again, it's meant to be for the world we live in today. Anything jump out at you in particular from this list that you said, yeah, that's a really good, insightful point? Or was it all too general, too vague for your liking?
No, good solid stuff. And of course, the tips I loved were the ones that, I've always been writing about, funnily enough. I mean, I love the notion, I call it funnels of serendipity, how random chance can change your life. How one introduction, one conversation, as you said in the beginning, can alter your life. But those things don't happen when you're lying in bed or sitting at your desk even. They happen when you're in motion. They happen when you're out and about. They happen when you put your talents on display. They happen when you talk to strangers. Now, there's an interesting one. What's the thing that I know you've got 4 young boys, Johnny. What's the thing we all teach our kids? We always say, don't talk to strangers. But actually, statistically, our kids are at more danger from friends and family than they are from strangers. But that whole notion of not talking to strangers is something that you have to get over if you want to build a diverse network. You have to seek out what I call unlike-minded people. You actually have to go and look for people who are different from you, because there's that concept called homophily, which is kind of a fancy Greek word, which means the tendency we have to always spend time with people just like us. The old birds of a feather flock together notion. But you and I live in a city, Dublin, where I was giving you the stats before the show. I mean, 33% of the working age population of Dublin were not born in Ireland. So this is an intensely diverse city. But the question is, does your network reflect the diversity of the city you live in, the economy you operate in, and the society you operate in? And if it doesn't, all the research by all the great houses will say you as an organization, you as an individual, you underperform. So that's a particular challenge for us. So I grew up in this city, and it was what we used to call male, pale, and stale. This was not a very international cosmopolitan city. In fact, I told a joke the other night. I said I went into a restaurant back in those days and I asked the waiter, what's the soup du jour? And he said, hang on, I'll go in and I'll ask the chef. So he goes into the chef and he comes out and he says to me, "It's soup of the day," right? So that was back then. We were not very cosmopolitan, but now this is an extraordinary city to be living in. So, things change and we need to change with it, and our networks need to change with it.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's something, a couple of the tips in that article slightly irked me, as they're easy tips, but they don't, I think, convey the proper essence of networking, in that they're saying, make sure you're posting on LinkedIn, your online, your social media presence, which there's no harm in. And too often people look at, how do I build better networks for my job, for my company, and they think, how do I use social media? To me, networking has always been in mindset. It hasn't been a list of tasks per se. It starts with a mindset. It's being open. It's having a different relationship with, okay, what are you trying to get out of this? Networking isn't seeking out others through which you can gain more opportunity. It's kind of just being interested in people, interesting in the rich tapestry of life out there and backgrounds. And to your point, it is the lack of homogeny in your network that makes it interesting. I have a transition year student, Gavin, working with me today. He's sitting in the room listening to this podcast for his week of work placement. For those of you not in Ireland, that's a kind of, when you're 15, 16, you do a year's kind of between exams type education. And, yesterday we spoke with a bunch of folks in Germany. Then we went to calls in the US. This morning we started with calls in the Czech Republic and moved on to India and then back to the US. And now here we are, hopefully talking to an international audience. I love that I can go around the world from this room. And that's the world we live in. Technology wise, it's just so easy. And you can have fluid conversations, and you're actually learning around about the world, because most of us start a conversation with, how's COVID? How are we getting on? The person tells you what it's like in their state, their country, what's going on in their world, the politics, the weather. You just get this broader perspective of life, that if you were just looking at the same group, and maybe we did this the old ways, maybe when we just relied on in-person networking, we did hang around with the same people, the same look and feel, the same ideas. And if it's done anything good, I think forcing you to kind of broaden that network, which is really the important part, I think is good. But I'm going to stop. I'm talking too much, and I'm not the guest here, Kingsley.
You're doing a great job.
I'd love to ask you about something that was mentioned in the first article. The article mentioned this concept of concentric rings, that we have. If you think of 6 rings of a tree, the center ring is about 5 people, the people you go to, your nearest, dearest in trouble. And then on the outside, up to 1,500 people who you kind of know by face, but that's about it. You'd recognize them in a crowd. You used a concept that was very similar when I first heard you talk, and you talked about the bench. And I'd love if you could just reshare that with our audience, to talk about, the different levels of a network and which parts of that network are more important, and the mindset way of thinking about it. I think it's a really important thing to share.
Yeah, look, I think I've always been a great fan of a guy called Robin Dunbar. And Dunbar, he was a professor in Oxford of anthropology, and he came up with a concept called Dunbar's number. And, the Facebooks and these companies all around the world have all kind of, worshipped at the shrine of Dunbar's number. And Dunbar's number basically says that, technology is changing at a ferocious pace, but up here, this ability, this cognitive ability you have here has not changed in a billion years. So, and he says the maximum number of relationships you can have at any one time is 150, including friends and family. So you can't have thousands of people up. You just don't have the bandwidth and the ability to be able to do that. So park that concept. And then the other concept kind of meshes with that, is that, your weak connections can be much more helpful to you than your strong connections. For some of the points we said earlier, the strong connections are just like you. Not only do you know them, you know what they think, you know who they know, you know their views and knows their opinions, etc. So your weak connections, there's some great research in America by a guy called Granovetter that said your next job will come from your weak connections, because they bridge you into different sorts of people in different sorts of places. And that was the kind of the origin of that kind of bench concept, in that, and also this notion that, you have to audit your network, to be able to answer the following question: is my network good enough for where I want to be in the next few years? You actually have to do a physical exercise of auditing your network, which means printing it off and looking at it and you'll see straight away three things. The first thing you'll see when you audit your network is that, you know, you've a load of redundant entries in there. I mean, I had takeaways in Sydney or dry cleaners in Boston where I lived. I don't need them. So you can clean up your network. That's a good exercise. The second thing is you realize you've got some real major gaps in your network. You know nobody in aircraft leasing or tourism or whatever it is, or lives in Brisbane, you know, so you can begin the exercise of filling them. And then the other thing, and this has been so interesting during COVID, you can discover you had some dormant connections. You have some great people in your network from the past, and you've just lost touch with them. Nothing happened. You didn't have a row or a fight, but you know, you went this way, they went that way. You know, life gets in the way. 4 boys, very busy. You know, so how are you going to? You know, you lose touch. So what I did during COVID was every week I connected just with one dormant connection that I had. So now it's nearly 60, 70 people I've had great conversations with. I've picked up where I left off. And that's been fascinating. Not only have I moved on and hopefully up, but so have they. So there are certain things that you can do if you like to develop that kind of bench strength of your network, and they're practical things. And you also have to segment your network, because you see, not everybody in your network is the same. And I have this theory of categorizing it into 4 different categories. It's like a pyramid. And at the bottom of the pyramid is a contact. And a contact is a name on your network, and for the life of you, you can't remember who they were. You must have met them at a reception, on a flight, at a football game, something like that. You swapped a card and you've put them on your network, but you can't remember who they are. So that's pretty damn weak. And then moving up, you have a connection, and a connection is, you know them, they know you. There's an element of familiarity. If they called you, they'd know who you were, and vice versa, but you're not doing anything. So that's a bit better. And then moving up again is a relationship. You know them, they know you. You're doing stuff together. You're doing business together. You like each other. And then the key one, you trust each other. And, you know, we live in a world where trust is pretty much at its lowest level in recorded history. Edelman, the great communications company, do an annual trust survey. And they found that trust in 4 institutions, government, media, nonprofit, and business, is at its lowest level in recorded history. So if you got that kind of trust and like, and that's really great in your network. And then at the very top, I call it a friend. And I have people I work with are friends. I have friends who are friends. And I don't have many in this category. It's a small category for me, because my definition of this category is somebody you could call on their cell phone on a Sunday afternoon. And you wouldn't do that to many people. In fact, you'd probably only call these sorts of people if you had a problem or a bit of a personal or family crisis. And so now you've got some shape on your network. So this is quite not a bad exercise to do during lockdown, is to actually put shape on it. Then you begin to see where you need to take some action. Because in networking, you have to take action. Because if you don't take action, then quick as a flash, nothing happens, you know? And that's the challenge. You know, you can talk a lot about this stuff, but you actually have to take action.
Yeah, I'd love to maybe hear from some of our live audience listening what they have done to try and maintain their networking during COVID. Love to hear any ideas that any of you have. Do jump into the comments and share them out here. I love that active approach, and just the one a week. It's simple, right? But it makes sense. And even your comment around, it's not your closest network will probably help you get your next job. You know, it's not your brother, it's not your cousin, not your best friend. It's highly unlikely they'll get you your next job. It's the person you met 3 years ago and you happen to bump into again, or they come across a notification to say you're looking for a job, and they go, I think I can help you. You're 100% right. It is those weaker ties that often give you those opportunities. You know, how did you go about selecting from the 60? Like, was it just, I'll pick any name and I'll eventually get to everybody? Or what was your methodology for getting to kind of selecting each week, who should I make the next person I reach out to?
Yeah, I did it partly geographically. I lived for 8 years in Australia. I lived 15 years in the United States. I lived in London. So I looked at each of those and I kind of segmented a little bit and split between them. Then I thought about people I knew from school and college. And then I thought about people I knew from different companies I worked. And then I thought about, as I said, people geographically. So I kind of spread the whole thing. And I've just found it to be a very refreshing and interesting exercise. And I didn't really realize, you know, the strength of my network until I got stuck into this. And I realized, you know, I had some really great connections in the past. I think everybody has these connections and we've tended to let them die. And they're the hidden value in your network, is dormant connections.
What does bad networking look like, Kingsley? So, you know, what are the attributes of, you know, you've seen when you've heard of where you go, that's not networking, you're doing it wrong, or that's not the best way to do it? What would be the top things that come to mind?
Well, I'll go back to your definition of networking, which totally gels with my definition of networking. Networking is not about you at all. Networking is not about even getting anything for yourself. Networking is about giving. Networking is about giving to individuals on a consistent daily basis, that it becomes a habit, it becomes a ritual, it becomes who you are. And it's based on a really simple premise. And you reiterated it earlier. The more you give to individuals, the more it comes back to you from the network. So I think that here's an interesting thing. I mean, first of all, networking has got a lousy image. I mean, most people really hate the concept of networking. It sums up images of sleazy, slimy individuals late at night flicking out business cards in a bar. You wake up in the morning, you find Johnny's business card in the turn up of your trousers. Where did that come from? And that's the kind of image of it. And interestingly enough, the word network, the noun, sounds pretty positive. Somebody having a good network, that sounds pretty good. But the verb, networking, no, that sounds inauthentic, sleazy, slimy, and kind of even, dare I say it, a little bit dirty. So there's some real problems with networking. It's not taught at school or college. It's not a KPI. You're not rewarded or compensated for it. The recruitment process doesn't show up in the recruitment process. So there's some fascinating things, and we tend to mix up networking and sociability. We tend to think the most sociable person is by definition the best networker. And here's what's really fascinating. Introverts can be better at networking than extroverts. And why is that? Because they do it with decency, authenticity, integrity, honesty. They ask questions and they listen. The extrovert, pushy networker out there who does it, to answer your question, who does it badly, who is trying to wow you all the time, who's interrupting you all the time, who's looking over your shoulder to find somebody more interesting, who likes to spread their social capital very thinly amongst a lot of people. That really kind of pisses people off. Dale Carnegie, who wrote one of the classics in this area, How to Win Friends and Influence People. I mean, he said it so many, many years ago. He said the important thing is to be interested rather than interesting. He said a really good question beats a really good comment. He said the smile on your face is more important than the clothes on your back. He said the sweetest sound that anybody ever heard was the sound of their own name. He said, when you talk about yourself, people think you're a bore. When you let them talk about themselves, they think you're an interesting conversationalist. And lots more kind of slightly folksy kind of stuff that was written. Those things haven't changed a whole heap over the generations, which is one of the interesting things about networking. That despite all the technology, some of those old truisms remain true today.
Well, I think we forget that our brains don't change that fast. We are who we are, and it changes over the millennia, perhaps. But you're so right. The networking scares people. I've heard some great comments on this, or pieces of advice. One I really loved was that one of the great ways to start a conversation at a public event, because I'll be honest with you, I don't like public events where you enter a room, you don't know somebody, and you're told to go in there and network. I hate that. I despise it. And that, for those who know me, you might think that's crazy. I'm sure Johnny loves that. I despise it, nothing more. I would have fear. I would want someone to come in with me, go, come on, come with me, come into that. I'm not going in by myself. I do it, and people think I'm great at it, but I have to be intentional. And the technique I was taught, which you've already mentioned, was to just arm yourself with your first few questions. Your job, you think the fear is, you go, what will I say? You don't have to say anything. Trust me, people love the sound of their own voice. If you ask them enough questions, they'll keep talking, and they'll go, he was a really interesting guy. He really, I loved him. He never told me a thing about himself, but he asked some questions. And one of the best questions, I've used this, that I was told to start with, was, where are you from? And the person who suggested this to me said, you get two answers in a business context. Either someone will hear your question as, where do I work? And they'll tell you about their job and their company, or they'll see it on a personal level and tell you where they come from. Now, either way, it's great. And whatever answer you get, flip it and ask them the other side of the equation. That's brilliant. So where are you from? Where you hail from? Or if they tell you where they're from, great, where do you work? And you've got two really interesting answers in one question, and you just expand so much. I think that is, people starve for these tactical things, Kingsley. Like, tell me what I actually need to do. I get the idea. I get I should do it, but I hate it. I don't want to do it because I fear I'm going to have to talk. What are some of the things you teach individuals, aside from the concepts, etc.? What are some of the other tips that you give folks?
Well, look, picking up on what you just said, I mean, people absolutely hate going into a room where they know nobody. There's a guy called Andy Lapata who wrote a book called "And Death Came Third," and what he said was he did some research about greatest fears in life, and death was number 3. Number 2 was walking into a room where you know nobody, and number 1 was, I guess you guessed, it's public speaking. I mean, these are the great kind of fears, and I think. I think we have to accept something early in the piece. I mean, I didn't network. In fact, I wasn't very good at networking early on, and I certainly didn't network at school or college. And I think that sounds a bit naff to even expect people to do that. So early in life, your network, it tends to be organic. It depends on your family, your friends, the school. You go to sports, hobbies, holidays, all that kind of stuff, and that's fine. But as you progress through life, you actually have to become more intentional, strategic, and thoughtful about your network. And sometimes I think schools and colleges are to blame for this, because in school and college, you get a metric, you get a grade, you get a score, you get a mark, and that determines your progress. Then you get into the real world, and there's a whole series of things that determine your progress, which you can't actually count. Empathy, emotional intelligence, curiosity, personality, trustworthiness, your character. All of those things count, but can't be counted. And that's one of the great sort of struggles in that. So I think that, we have to take a sort of a wide lens approach at these things. And we have to realize that as our careers progress, the technical skills we needed to get our job in the first instance, critically important as they are, become less important, and relationships become more important. I'm a fan of a guy called, I don't know if you ever come across this guy called Harvey Coleman, an American, who wrote a book called The Pie Theory about career progress. And it's just fascinating because written some time ago, but he said some outrageous things. He said, how well you do in your job depends 10% on how well you do your job. So that sounds crazy. Surely you got to, how well you do your job should be like 80, 90%. He said, no. He said, doing a great job is mandatory. It's the minimum. It's the price of entry. It gets you on the pitch. He said, it gets you on the ladder, but doesn't get you up the ladder. Career progress is about going up the ladder. He said, you get paid on performance. You get promoted on what other people think of your potential. So he said, it's the I and the E of his pie theory that matter about career progress and networking. And the I stands for image. What do people think of you? What are you known for? What's your reputation? Your reputation is what somebody says about you when you're not in the room. So that's 30% of career progress. And then he says 60% of your career progress depends on E. And E stands for exposure. Who's seen you in action? Who's seen you perform? Who's seen you at meetings? Who's seen you deliver? What are you known for? What are you a go-to person for? Are you known within the company? Are you known outside the company? So they're all, really interesting notions and concepts. And, basically it turns on its head the piece of advice I got from my parents leaving college and going to my first job, which was work hard, keep your head down, and keep out of trouble, which actually wasn't very good advice. And this whole notion, and many people have this notion, you know what? I'm going to work really hard. I'm going to do a super job, and I'm going to let my work speak for itself. But here's the problem, Johnny. Work doesn't speak. Other people speak. And the person who I think has personified this whole approach to career progress and networking is a woman called Carla Harris. I don't know if you've ever come across her. 35 years in Morgan Stanley, African-American, on Wall Street, phenomenal individual, great TED Talks, great YouTube videos. But she says a fabulous line. I've always remembered this line from her. She said, you got to remember something, that all major decisions about your career, about your compensation, about your promotion would be taken by a group of people sitting around a table in a room, and you won't be in that room. So she said, all these people have power, but if they're not going to use their power for somebody they don't know. So she said, in your career, you need to have performance currency, which means doing a super job. That's the minimum. And you need to have relationship currency. You need to get to know people. So she says, you have to develop 3 different types of people in your network. You need an advisor who will help you technically with your job. That's important. You need a mentor, and that could be somebody in your company or outside your company, and they'll give you the good, the bad, and the ugly, and that'll be great. But you need the third thing, which is critical. You need a sponsor. She said, a mentor talks to you, a sponsor talks about you. So they're kind of brutal things that, we don't get told this at school or college. We got to learn this thing on our own. There's a lot of unwritten rules of business that you got to kind of have to learn the hard way. You got to be, as I said, you got to be smart. Everybody's smart, but you got to be savvy. And savvy means being streetwise, having cop on, and understanding the unwritten rules of business progress. Does that make sense?
It makes a whole lot of sense. I'll connect it to two recent, I call it stories around things I've been involved in lately. One is we had an event last week, Kingsley, on the importance of onboarding and how you do onboarding in the virtual world. And we had several people speaking, including the global head of onboarding delivery for IBM. And she onboards 30,000 people a year, or our programs do. And she talked about how IBM moved away from an onboarding focus, which was around information share, to how people feel. And they used the research that suggested that the most important thing to do when you're onboarding someone is help them build relationships in the company. And that the key person in that is their manager. And that the manager's job, typically the manager sees her job as, I need to teach Kingsley everything. I'm saying, no, that's not your job. Your job is to introduce Kingsley to everybody and advocate for him and help him build the new network that he's going to have. And that correlated with high retention rates and future promotion rates and success rates in the organization. And I was saying that that's the thing you need to focus on. New employee, how do I give her the relationships she needs in the organization? How can I leverage my network to give her the network she doesn't yet have? And the second story was around work we did, we're doing at the moment, and we'll have them on the show in a few months' time. An organization in Ireland called the Open Doors Initiative. I'm not too sure if you're familiar with them, Kingsley. They work with individuals from disadvantaged communities in Ireland, from the immigrant populations, from populations of those with disabilities, from the traveling community, and they try and get them into employment and train them up. And we're going to be working with them on something that we'll talk about in a few months. But one of the key things that they shared with us around what works, they said, is that you need someone who's going to be a mentor. And their definition of it, they said, you could educate someone, give them a course, train them up, give them the skills and qualification, but you need somebody to, first of all, help them, give them advice, but advocate for them. To your point around the sponsor, he said that person who gets to know them as a mentor becomes the person who champions them, who tells employers why they should hire them, who speaks to them and says, I know this person. That person may not be good at interviewing, probably isn't. They're probably not good and they don't have the confidence at explaining themselves and their competencies. But the key thing is to have that advocate, that sponsor, to your point, who's going to sell for you, because there's so many people out there who are great, but you just don't have somebody, to your point, shouting about it and telling them, because they just don't have that natural skill themselves. So I love that. I love that concept, Kingsley.
Yeah, I mean, Carla Harris says you need somebody carrying your paper into that room. And she's wonderful. Your listeners, if you go on YouTube or go on TED Talk, Carla Harris, Carla Harris, she's just a really inspiring individual. And everything she says, I believe, is kind of really, really spot on. I mean, I think the other thing that's happening out there is that companies want to hire and wire. They want to hire people and wire into their network. So now when you're being interviewed for a job, they want to know about your qualifications. They want to know about your experience, but they want to know something else. They want to know who you know, because you see, we live in a world where it's not what you know. It's not even who you know. It's who knows you. So that becomes an asset. So your network becomes a portable asset that you own, you've built. When you move to another company, it goes with you. And that becomes attractive to companies. In a world of trying to attract and retain talent, this is a real asset that you have. It's a great competitive advantage when you have something like that to carry with you. Don't you think?
Yeah, it's a big theme around, a lot of corporates call it employee advocacy, is a way that they try and leverage that, which is you're trying to get your employees to be your recruiters. Everyone in the business is always recruiting for your organization. But they need to have the right networks. And I think it's no point in having an advocate who doesn't have a network, who's not known by anybody in that strict business sense. You want people who are well connected and they know how to leverage that network. So I think organizations are waking up to the importance of this, the power of having employees who have a network and are willing to leverage their network, are willing to mix their network up to give them, I guess, through 6 degrees of separation, we reach everybody. So, and to your point around the costs, if you could leverage your own staff to reach folks, why not do that above spending all the amount of money you might spend at career fairs and on technology and everything else to try and do that? So
also, I think, Johnny, there's a concept of network intelligence, and that your staff, your employees, they can be your eyes and ears and scouts and spies. They can find out what's going on and report back on it. And I think that notion, and you have to accept, I think it's Reid Hoffman says, founded LinkedIn. He said, you realize that there's more smart people outside your company than inside your company. Just by definition, there's a huge amount of talent out there. And so that's a really interesting way of looking at things. So, you got to invest in your people. You got to teach them, train them, and help them become really good at that. I remember the old cliche from the old days, that said, if Hewlett-Packard knew what Hewlett-Packard knows, it would be a great company. In other words, they have such talent and ability, but they had struggled to get that out of their people. So I think that's an interesting notion, that idea of network intelligence.
So, Kingsley, I can't believe we're at time already. We're at that point in the show where it's my job, unfortunately, to wrap up. I could continue chatting with you for a couple of hours, especially so much wisdom. It cost me a fortune on the books I'll have to buy at the end of this, but I'll take them. Kingsley, we ask all of our guests at the end of every show to leave us with one piece of advice for our audience, for our shortlist of advice. And that is either something that you've gained experience in or knowledge yourself. So from your own knowledge, you said, this is the advice I'll give you, or perhaps it's something that somebody else gave you in your career and you choose to reshare on. But what would that one piece of advice be for our audience today?
Do you know, somebody said it to me once and it made me think a lot about it. They said, always remember something small about people. Some small piece of seemingly kind of trivial piece of information that might seem trivial, but for them is really important. And when you repeat that back to them years and years later, they'll always remember that. So, Johnny, I know you've got 4 boys. I know you're a U2 fanatic. I know you're a runner, So straight away, there's those things. And I think the last thing I'd say is, in every interaction with everybody, always remember 3 questions when you connect with someone. The first question is, what can I do for you? Not the other way around. The second question is, if you were me, what would you do? And you're paying respect and deference to wisdom, etc. And the third question is, who do you know who lives in Brisbane, works in aircraft leasing? And that's the gold dust question, because what you're really saying is, are you willing to put your name and reputation on the line and make an introduction for me? And introductions are like having a passport at the border. So I'd leave, and my final comment would be, what you're trying to do all the time is to turn cold calls into hot coffees.
I love that, Kingsley. Fantastic way to end. Thanks so much for joining us, imparting that wisdom. Looking forward to having you back again to continue the conversation. I know we can take it miles from here, and I'm going to be more intentional with my networking. And as someone I haven't spoken to in a couple of years, it's been a pleasure to have you back reconnected. And let's not drop that connection that we have it again, Kingsley.
Great. You're one of my dormant connections, Johnny. I'll be calling.
Thanks for the reminders. Well, thanks for joining us, Kingsley, and thanks for joining us for you listening live or listening to the podcast. We'll be back next week. Next week's show, I'm also equally excited about. We have the fantastic Dr. Mary Collins, who's a chartered psychologist and professional executive coach, and one of the smartest people I know, also living and based here in Dublin, in Ireland. She's going to be talking about leveraging the strengths of a multi-generational workforce. Mary started telling me several years ago about her research into this, and she is living at the coalface of this, the research and the training she develops for individuals to try and understand what are the next challenges of different generations coming into the workforce, how are organizations coping with these different opportunities and challenges as well. And she's going to be coming to share some of her insights from her new book with us next week. That's on Wednesday, the 2nd of June. And that's, of course, at Ireland, UK time, 4 o'clock, which is 11 a.m. on the East Coast of the US, 8 a.m. on the West Coast. Or you can check out the podcast, which usually goes live Wednesday evening or first thing on the Thursday morning. If you want to find out more about our show, you can always find it at socialtalent.com/the shortlist. But don't forget the advice from today's speaker is you want to turn that cold call into a warm coffee. Try it next week. Be more intentional with your networking, and we'll see you next Wednesday.